A speech community, or sometimes called a linguistic community, is a term that sociolinguists and anthropologists use to describe how language or linguistic practices are organized within a specific social group. It helps us understand that language isn't just about words and grammar, but also about the social connections and shared practices among people. John Leon offered a very simple definition of a speech community. He described it as all the people who use a particular language or dialect. But while this definition is straightforward, many scholars believe it's not enough because it doesn't fully capture the social or cultural unity that binds these groups together. For example, English is spoken all around the world, but the communities that use it may be very isolated from each other and share little beyond the language itself. So, just knowing who speaks a language doesn't tell us about their social or cultural ties. Ultimately, a speech community is seen as a shared social space, a kind of communal possession, where speakers use specific linguistic features to create a sense of group identity or to differentiate themselves from others. It's really about how language functions as a tool for social belonging and group cohesion. So, in the context of this presentation, it's important to see that speech communities aren't just about language use. They're about the social bonds and shared identities that language helps to build and maintain. When we look at alternative definitions of communities, the focus shifts from just shared language systems to the idea of regular interaction and ongoing communication. John Gumperz, for example, described a community as a social group that stays connected through frequent social interaction patterns. He pointed out that these communities are often separated from others by what he called weaknesses in the lines of communication, meaning there are subtle barriers that maintain their distinctiveness. What's interesting about Gumperz's model is that it allows for multilingual speech communities. These are groups where people might not share a single language, but they still use a common set of verbal signs regularly. So, the key isn't necessarily a shared language, but rather consistent communication that fosters a sense of community. This perspective really emphasizes that for a community to exist, it needs internal social cohesion, that sense of togetherness, and it must be distinguishable from others through its unique contact patterns. In essence, what holds a community together is how people interact, and the social bonds they build through those interactions, which aligns with our broader theme of understanding how language and social life are interconnected. William Labov argued that a speech community isn't just about everyone agreeing on how they use language, but more about participation in shared norms. These shared norms show up in evaluative behavior, where members, regardless of their individual speech patterns, recognize certain varieties as the standard or best way of speaking. For example, all New Yorkers are considered part of the same speech community because they generally agree on the prestige of pronouncing post-vocalic R, even if they don't all use it the same way. So, membership in a speech community means having the sociolinguistic skills to interpret what's being communicated and to behave appropriately within the community's regular activities. This idea of shared norms and evaluative behavior really highlights how social identity and perceptions shape our language use, tying back to the overall theme of how communities create a sense of belonging through language. The concept of a speech community can actually be quite slippery, because it's often not clear where we should draw the boundaries around a particular group. These boundaries tend to be fluid and porous, meaning they can shift depending on the context. They're defined both geographically and socially, and the level of specificity really influences how we see these communities. For example, you might identify with a global English community when you're online or in an international setting, but in a local neighborhood, you might switch to a specific dialect or way of speaking that's unique to that area. This idea of nested communities shows how flexible our speech identities can be. This fluidity becomes even more apparent in modern urban environments, where we talk about superdiversity. Here, speakers often claim different identities and shift their language codes depending on social situations. It's this constant shifting that highlights just how complex and dynamic the boundaries of speech communities really are, tying back to our overall theme of language as an adaptable and socially embedded phenomenon. So here we see that while speech communities are often large-scale and defined by more abstract norms, a community of practice is a bit different. It refers to a group that comes together around a shared activity or goal, where members are engaged in a common endeavor. At this level, think of a family, a sports team, or a work group. The way people speak is most closely coordinated and tailored for specific purposes. These communities of practice are really the social units where we experience daily social order and make sense of it together. It's within these smaller groups that our social identities are built. We constantly balance different versions of ourselves, depending on the group we're interacting with. Now, when we compare speech communities and communities of practice, the key difference is scale and focus. Speech communities are broader and more norm-driven, while communities of practice are more about shared activities and immediate, practical communication. Both are essential for understanding how language functions in social life and how we shape our identities through these interactions.